A while back I talked to you about two ancient riverine civilizations, ancient Sumer and ancient Egypt. Before we started talking about those two civilizations, though, I gave you two general principles of civilization. And this is review. You've got it all in your notes. The first general principle of civilization is that civilizations tended to develop alongside major rivers. In fact, when I gave you that first, and we talked about why, but the main reason you remember is to get access to fresh water. First of all, fresh water to drink, and then fresh water to feed and water your crops and animals. And you remember we talked about all that whenever we did. The first general principle of civilization is that civilizations in the ancient world tended to develop alongside major rivers. You'll remember, though, that I said I could make that even stronger to you, that there's only one exception that I know of in the ancient world of a civilization that did not develop alongside a major river. And now's the time to start talking about that exception to that first general principle, and that is ancient Greece. Ancient Greece is the exception to the rule. Ancient Greece does not develop alongside a major river. First, let me point out to you where Greece is on the world, so that I know you already know, but I'm just going to point it out to you. Here is some of the satellite imagery we used earlier when we talked about Sumer and Egypt. There we go. Over here is ancient Mesopotamia. Over here, ancient Egypt. And up here, ancient Greece. As we look at the map, these parts of the world are not all that far away from each other. But as we're going to see by the time we finish up talking about Greece, three very different cultures, three very different ways of life. As we come in a bit closer, again, Mesopotamia is over here, Egypt, and Greece. I know you know where Greece is on a political map of Europe. It's down here. But that's modern Greece. When we talk about ancient Greece is much larger than we think of as modern Greece today. On the map you see that Greece expands into beyond what we think of as modern Greece today, which is about right there, roughly, up into the Balkans states, across where Turkey is, down to the island of Crete, up into what's called the Bosphorus, the division between the land there that goes into the Black Sea. So it's much larger than what we think of as modern Greece today. And there again, the red dots indicate very large Greek cities in ancient Greece. So that's a little geography lesson. Back to our first general principle. The first general principle of ancient civilization. Civilization tended to develop alongside major rivers, but Greece is the exception. For one thing, there aren't any major rivers in Greece. That's one reason why. Now, I'm not saying there's no rivers in Greece. I'm saying there's no major rivers, nothing like the Nile River in Egypt or the Tigris and Euphrates rivers in Mesopotamia, or like the Yangtze River in China or the Ganges River in India or any other of these other ancient riverine civilizations. Instead, Greece is a very mountainous area. Most of what we think of as ancient Greece is very mountainous. That means that just about everybody has a little mountain stream floating through their property. And if it turns out that you don't happen to have a little mountain stream flowing through your property, well, then you make a deal with your neighbor and you dig a ditch over to your neighbor's mountain stream and you divert some water over to your property for your family and your crops and animals. And maybe you make a deal where you pay your neighbor rent on the water every year, or maybe he just gives it to you for free. I mean, it comes out of the ground for free. You want to be a good neighbor, sure, dig a ditch over here, get some water for your family. It costs me nothing to come out of the ground. And so there's no need for those massive irrigation systems that we find in every other riverine civilization, because everybody already has access to fresh water. It comes out of the ground, and they've got a mountain stream flowing through their property, or they just get water from their neighbor's mountain stream. And so there's no need for the massive irrigation systems of ancient Sumer, Egypt, China, India, or anywhere else. That means that that second general principle I gave you when we talked about this topic also comes into play. That second general principle is that every riverine civilization developed what I would recognize as a dictatorship. And I told you why. Because in every riverine civilization, somebody figured out, if I get control of the water supply, everybody's going to do what I tell them to do. Again, the key to being a successful dictator is to get control of something everybody needs to have to survive. And that's a pretty short list of things, but water's on the list. And in every riverine civilization, somebody figured out how they could get control of the irrigation system, get control of the water supply. But that's impossible in ancient Greece because everybody has access to fresh water. Everybody has a little mountain stream flowing through their property already. And that means that there's going to be nothing like the dictatorships that we see in other parts of the world. Because it's going to be a very long time before anybody in this part of the world figures out how to get control of something everybody needs to have to survive. And when they do, it's not going to be water. There's going to be something else on that list of things everybody needs to have to survive. But it won't be water, it'll be something else. And we'll catch up to that when we catch up to it, okay? But we're going to see nothing like the dictators of ancient China, ancient India, ancient Egypt, ancient Mesopotamia. Now, of course, sometimes people will try to be dictators. That's just human nature. But when those attempts are made, they oftentimes aren't successful. And when they are successful, they don't last very long. And while they last, they have nothing like the power of the Egyptian pharaoh or the Chinese emperor. Because they never can figure out, at least for a while, it takes them a while, how to get control of something everybody needs to have to survive. In fact, in one part of ancient Greece, a group of people are going to experiment with a form of government called a democracy, which in a lot of ways, the democracy is the exact opposite of a dictatorship. In a lot of ways, it's the same thing as a dictatorship. We'll talk about that when we get to it. We'll have that important conversation when we get to it. But at least they look different. When you walk into a democracy and you ask, who's the dictator around here, people don't say, oh, it's that guy who lives in that big house up on the hill, and if we don't do what he tells us to do, he cuts off our water. Well, we'll talk about democracy when we get to it, okay? But at least it looks different, and in a lot of ways it's a very different form of government. And so, right from the beginning, we see that geography plays an important role in shaping Greek culture, because there's nothing like the dictators that we see in every other civilization in the ancient world, every other riverine civilization. Geography plays another role. Oops, don't write that down yet. Geography plays another role in shaping Greek culture. Again, Greece is a very mountainous area. Farmland is very rare. It's hard to find farmland. Greece is also a very rocky place. It's a very rocky territory. It's in a very mountainous place. And it's hard to find farmland because either there's no dirt, it's just a bunch of pebbles. It's very hard to grow crops in pebbles. Or else it's up the side of a mountain. And as the population of Greece expands, then the Greeks run into a problem. And that is, there's not enough farmland to grow food to feed the people. That's a big problem. But the Greeks, being kind of smart, just like everybody else we've talked about in the course so far, being smart people, came up with an invention. They figured out a way that you can grow 40 acres of wheat on 5 acres of land. Now, a little bit about what I just said there, 40 acres of wheat. 40 acres of wheat is historian shorthand for the idea that just about at any point in history, and just about anywhere where people live, if you have 40 acres of land, and you plant most of that land in wheat, then you can feed a good-sized family for a year. 40 acres of wheat, you can feed actually a pretty big family for a year. Now that's just shorthand. In real life, you know, you would have a vegetable garden for some variety, and you would have maybe some hogs for protein and that kind of thing. But it's just the idea that if you've got 40 acres of land, and you plant most of that land in wheat, then you can feed a good-sized family, a big family, for a year. That's true just about any place where people live. No, not the Eskimos, but just about every place where people live. If you got 40 acres of land and you have access to wheat seed, well then you can feed a good-sized family for a year. The problem is you live in ancient Greece. You've got a good-sized family, but farmland is very rare. a pretty typical family. You're a pretty big-sized family, but you've only got 5 acres of land. You got to grow 40 acres of wheat on your 5 acres of land to feed your family for a year. Well, that's a big problem. You got to grow 8 times as much food. But they figure out how you can do it. And, well, you're not going to get 8 harvests in a year. And fertilizer isn't going to improve your yield 800%. You got to figure out something more than that. But they finally figure it out. How can you grow 40 acres of wheat on 5 acres of land? Well, it's a pretty neat trick. To grow 40 acres of wheat on 5 acres of land, you plant olive trees. And then, as the olives ripen, you make olive oil, and you trade 5 acres of olive oil for 40 acres worth of wheat. You see how it works? It's a pretty neat trick. You produce what you can produce, what somebody else wants, and you trade it for what you can't produce. And here we've got a big invention. International trade. Now, of course, the Greeks don't invent trading things. Different groups of people have traded things ever since there have been different groups of people. But not on this kind of level. Well, the Greeks are going to bet their lives every year and the lives of their kids that it's going to work. They're going to spend their growing season producing, let's just say, 5 acres of olive oil, and they're going to bet that somebody shows up from somewhere else with 40 acres of wheat to trade for their 5 acres of olive oil. Because if you've got 40 acres of wheat, you can feed a good-sized family for a year. If you've got 5 acres of olive oil, you're not going to have a very healthy family at the end of that year. But they're going to bet their lives every year that it works. And they figure out pretty quickly that if it's going to work, they're going to have to produce something that people want. They're going to have to come to rely on the production of what today economists call luxury goods. Now, luxury goods are things that you don't necessarily need to have to survive, but that they're pretty nice to have. And once you've taken care of all the stuff you need to have to survive, and you have a little bit of money left over, well then, you'll spend that money on things that are nice to have. And pretty quickly, the Greek economy is going to come to rely on the production of 2 luxury goods. I've given you one of them already, producing olives to make olive oil, and grapes to produce wine. Olive oil and wine. 2 nice things to have, but certainly don't need to have them to survive, but they're pretty nice to have. By the way, just some thoughts about olive oil. Olive oil is going to show up a couple of times in the semester. So I want you to understand that olive oil in the ancient world is much more important than olive oil is today, what you and I think of. That's because there's a lot of uses of olive oil that we've forgotten about in our modern world because we have better stuff. But in the ancient world, if you needed oil for something, you pretty much had 2 choices, either animal fat or olive oil. Those are pretty much your choices. And for a lot of things, olive oil is a lot better to use than animal fat. For example, if you have a leather jacket, I hope you know this if you have a leather jacket, then every once in a while you have to oil the leather, or else the leather will dry out and crack and rip and shred, and you pay a lot of money for a leather jacket, you don't take care of it, then it starts to fall apart and deteriorate. Now you're living in the ancient world. You've got 2 choices of oil to use. Are you going to oil your jacket with olive oil or pork fat? I'll go ahead and tell you olive oil. Now the pork fat will work. It'll preserve the leather, but it's not going to preserve your friends. About day number 5 or 6 of walking around town with rotten pork fat jacket on, you're not going to be very popular. Everybody's going to know when you're coming, and they're going to be very thankful when you leave. Okay. Now, to be honest, you and I would smell the rotten olive oil smell. We would recognize it and notice something is unusual, but that's a smell you can kind of get used to. You don't get used to rotten pork fat smell. Okay. It just works better to use olive oil. If you let's say you have something that's made out of iron that you want to keep and you don't want it to rust, like a nice knife or a sword blade. Well, you can use animal fat. You can use fish oil or beef fat to oil the leather, the iron, but for reasons that the biologist can explain better, animal fat cells are bigger than plant fat cells, and so the plant fat cells get down in the cracks and creases in the metal better than animal fat cells, and it just works better to preserve the metal. If you're mixing medicine into an oil base to make ointment to put to a place where you have an injury, then the medicine just blends better into olive oil than it does into animal fat. If you want to read after dark, you can make candles out of beef fat. They actually work very well. The problem is that when you light them, they smell like burning beef fat, because that's what they are. And it's just nicer if you have a little bit of extra money to spend for olive oil and you get a lantern and you put a wick in it, and it just smells nicer when it's burning. So there's a lot of uses of olive oil in the ancient world that you and I have forgotten about because we've got nicer stuff now. And so when I talk about olive oil, we're not talking about salad dressing. Nobody's going to load up a boat with 40 acres of oil to go get 40 acres of wheat to go get 5 acres of salad dressing. Okay, it's much more valuable in the ancient world than it is today. So this decision to rely primarily on the production of luxury goods, and in particular these two luxury products, has a tremendous impact on ancient Greek culture. And the way of figuring out what that impact is to follow this line of thought with me. Let's say you've got a 5 acres of olive trees. You've got a 5-acre grove of olive trees. How much time do you spend at the start of the growing season planting your olive trees for this year's harvest? Well, none. Once they're planted, they're planted. If you're fortunate, your grandparents planted them. You don't even have to plant them in the first time. There are olive trees in Greece which are hundreds of years old. You see one in the upper left-hand corner there on the screen, producing olives just fine, hundreds of years